Russia has spent $625 billion to take 12% of Ukraine. Do the math, and every square mile of captured ground has cost the Kremlin $21.5 million. That's not the price of a war. That's the price of a war Russia can barely afford to keep buying. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, Ukraine is burning through $172 million a day just to stay standing. Money it doesn't have, borrowed against Russian billions frozen in a Belgian vault that Moscow calls theft and Brussels calls leverage. Two governments, two balance sheets bleeding out in opposite directions. And somewhere between Moscow's shrinking reserves and Kyiv's borrowed billions, the real question of this war isn't who has more tanks, it's who runs out of money first. This is the financial war behind the war, and the numbers reveal something neither side wants you to see. To understand why this war has become a contest of balance sheets, you have to go back to the moment the guns started. In February 2022, when Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine, the assumption in most of the world was that this would be fast, a large, well-funded military against a smaller neighbor. Within weeks, maybe months, the outcome would be decided on the battlefield. That assumption collapsed almost immediately, and something else took its place. Ukraine didn't just fight with soldiers, it fought with an international financial system that mobilized against Russia within days. The United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and dozens of other countries froze roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank assets, money Russia had stored abroad for a financial cushion, suddenly locked out of reach. At the same time, Western governments began sending Ukraine money, weapons, and credit lines on a scale the world hadn't seen since the Second World War. The European Union alone has committed more than 177 billion euros in military, economic, and political support since the invasion began. The United States, before its posture shifted under the current administration, contributed over 114 billion euros through the Kiel Institute's tracking. Germany, France, and a coalition of smaller donors added tens of billions more. So from the very first weeks, this stopped being only a war of territory. It became a war of financial endurance, a test of which side could keep its economy functioning, keep paying its soldiers, keep buying weapons, and keep servicing its population for longer than the other. 4.5 years later, that test is still running, and the numbers have only gotten starker. On the Russian side, the government has poured an extraordinary share of its national wealth into sustaining the war. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, one of the most respected independent trackers of global military spending, Russia's total military expenditure has climbed every single year since the invasion began. In 2022, it was roughly 7.5 trillion rubles. By 2025, it had more than doubled to nearly 16 trillion rubles, consuming over 7% of the entire Russian economy in a single year. To put that in perspective, most countries spend somewhere between 1 and 2% of their economic output on their entire military in peacetime. Russia, in the fourth year of this war, was spending more than 7%. And that's before accounting for the parts of the budget the Kremlin no longer discloses. Reuters and independent analysts estimate that as much as 84% of Russia's defense spending is now classified, which means the real number is almost certainly higher than what shows up on paper. On the other side of the front line, Ukraine has been running a very different kind of survival economy. Roughly half of its war spending comes from its own domestic resources, taxes, bonds, whatever the country can generate internally while under constant bombardment. The other half depends almost entirely on outside support. According to Ukraine's own general staff, The country is now spending approximately $172 million a day simply to keep the war effort running. That's not a one-time cost. That's every single day, year after year, with no end date attached. What makes this especially interesting isn't just the size of these numbers, it's where the money is actually coming from and how fragile some of those sources have started to look. Russia's war machine runs almost entirely on energy exports, oil, gas, and coal sold to buyers willing to look past Western sanctions. China alone now accounts for roughly 40% of Russia's fossil fuel export revenue in any given month, according to the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, which tracks these flows in real time. That dependency didn't exist at this scale before the war. It's a direct consequence of the West cutting Russia off from its traditional energy customers in Europe. Ukraine's survival, meanwhile, runs on a different kind of dependency, one built on IOUs, frozen assets, and a coalition of governments that have to keep agreeing year after year to keep the money flowing. And as we're about to see, that coalition is starting to show real cracks at the exact moment Russia's own financial cushion is running thinner than it has at any point since the war began. Because here's what almost nobody is talking about. Both sides are burning through their financial reserves at the same time. The only question left is which one runs out first, and the answer to that question may already be visible if you know where to look at the money. To understand who's actually winning this financial war, you need to follow two very different money trails, one running out of Moscow, the other running into Kiev. Start with Russia. On paper, the Kremlin's war machine looks self-sufficient. Oil and gas revenue funds the military funds the front line, and the front line, in theory, delivers territory. But the mechanics underneath that simple story are far more fragile than they appear. Russia's oil exports are supposed to be capped. In an effort to limit how much revenue the Kremlin earns from every barrel, the G7 imposed a price ceiling on Russian crude, a rule that says international shipping and insurance companies can't handle Russian oil sold above a certain price. That cap currently sits at $44.10 a barrel, lowered from $60 earlier this year. In theory, that should be squeezing Russian oil revenue hard. In practice, it's leaking badly. Russia built what analysts call a shadow fleet, hundreds of aging tankers, often flagged to countries with little oversight, insured through opaque arrangements that dodge Western enforcement entirely. In April of 2026 alone, sanctioned shadow tankers carried the highest share of Russia's fossil fuel exports on record, 54% of everything Russia shipped. That fleet lets Russian oil, particularly its Pacific-grade ESPO crude, sell well above the price cap to buyers who don't ask questions. And the biggest buyer by far is China. In July 2026, China accounted for 43% of Russia's entire fossil fuel export revenue across its top 5 customers. Nearly 700 million euros in a single month just from Chinese purchases. Add India and Turkey, and you're looking at the vast majority of everything keeping Russian oil money flowing. This is the first mechanism worth understanding. Russia isn't funding its war through some closed, self-contained system. It's funding it through a very specific, very exposed relationship with a small handful of buyers, China most of all, who are willing to absorb sanctioned Russian energy at a discount. That gives those buyers enormous leverage. China isn't just a customer, it's become something closer to a financial lifeline. And every ruble the Kremlin spends on this war is, increasingly, a ruble that started as a Chinese payment for oil Europe refuses to touch anymore.
Now follow the money into Ukraine, and the mechanism looks completely different, because Ukraine isn't selling anything to fund a war. It's borrowing against a promise. Here's how that promise works. When the invasion began, Western governments froze roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank assets, money the Russian state had parked abroad long before the war, sitting mostly in European financial institutions, with the single largest concentration, nearly 200 billion euros, sitting in a Belgian clearinghouse called Euroclear. That frozen money can't simply be handed to Ukraine outright. Seizing a sovereign nation's assets outright would violate international law and set a precedent no government wants to touch. So the G7 built something more careful, an Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Initiative, or ERA. Instead of touching the frozen principal, the plan uses the interest and profits those frozen assets generate sitting in European accounts and channels that money to Ukraine as loan repayments. Loans Ukraine only has to pay back if and when Russia eventually pays war reparations. It's a clever piece of financial engineering. It gets money to Ukraine without technically confiscating Russian property. But it depends entirely on political unity holding across dozens of European governments. And in December 2025, that unity nearly broke. Belgium, the country hosting the bulk of the frozen assets, refused to expand the mechanism further, fearing Russian retaliation against Belgian interests. The Kremlin directly warned Belgian officials, according to reporting from the Financial Times, that touching those funds would have consequences Belgium would feel, in the Kremlin's words, for eternity. So instead of unlocking the full reparations loan Ukraine needed, European leaders settled for something smaller, a 90 billion euro loan for 2026 and 2027. Raised on capital markets rather than backed by Russian assets at all. It kept Ukraine funded, but it also revealed something important. Ukraine's financial survival isn't guaranteed by a fixed system. It's guaranteed by 27 governments continuing to agree year after year to keep writing checks. And that agreement is getting harder to reach every single time. So here's the mechanism in its simplest form. Russia turns sanctioned oil into cash through China. Ukraine turns Russia's own frozen billions into loans through Europe. Both systems work, for now, but both are far more exposed and far more fragile than either government wants the world to believe. If you're looking for the clearest winners in this financial war, you won't find them in Moscow or Kyiv. You'll find them in Beijing, Ankara, and New Delhi. China is the single biggest financial beneficiary of this entire conflict, and it didn't have to fire a single shot to get there. Before the war, Russia sold most of its oil and gas to Europe at market prices through established pipelines and long-term contracts. When Europe cut itself off from Russian energy, Russia needed a new customer fast, and it needed one large enough to absorb the volume Europe had left behind. China stepped into that gap, and it did so from a position of overwhelming leverage. Because Russia had nowhere else to sell that oil at scale, China could name its price. Reports from the Atlantic Council estimate that at peak discount levels, China has saved up to $28 million a day simply by buying sanctioned Russian crude below international market rates. Multiply that across years of purchases, and you're looking at tens of billions of dollars in savings that exist purely because Russia has no better option. That's not a trade relationship. That's a buyer with almost total pricing power over a desperate seller. And China has used that power methodically, importing record volumes of discounted Russian crude, pipeline gas, and coal month after month, while Western sanctions push Moscow further into economic isolation. Turkey and India play smaller but similarly opportunistic versions of the same game. Indian refineries have taken in record volumes of Russian crude throughout 2026. In July alone, India's imports hit an all-time high, worth roughly 5.5 billion euros.
Turkey has become the largest buyer of Russian refined oil products, repackaging sanctioned Russian barrels into products that can legally reach markets that would otherwise refuse them directly. Both countries profit from arbitrage, buying cheap, discounted Russian energy and either using it domestically or reselling it at a markup others can't access directly.
On the Ukrainian side of the ledger, the winners look completely different because almost nobody is profiting from Ukraine's war spending in the way China profits from Russia's. Instead, the closest thing to a beneficiary is the defense industry itself, spread across dozens of companies in the United States, Europe, and increasingly inside Ukraine. Since 2022, Western defense manufacturers have seen sustained multi-year demand unlike anything the industry experienced since the Cold War. Every artillery shell, missile system, and armored vehicle sent to Ukraine represents new revenue for defense contractors, revenue that continues as long as the war continues. It's a strange feature of modern warfare. The countries funding Ukraine's defense are, in part, funding their own domestic arms industries in the process. The money leaves government treasuries and, to a significant degree, comes right back into those same economies through defense sector jobs, manufacturing contracts, and industrial expansion. But here's the deeper story hiding underneath all of this. None of these winners, not China, not Turkey, not India, not the defense industry, actually need this war to end in a particular way. They benefit from the war continuing in its current grinding, expensive form more than they would benefit from a decisive victory on either side. A quick Russian collapse would end China's discount pipeline. A quick Ukrainian victory would end the sustained demand for Western weapons. The financial incentives of nearly every major outside player point toward prolongation, not resolution. And that's a far more uncomfortable truth than most coverage of this war is willing to say out loud. If China, Turkey, and the defense industry sit on the winning side of this ledger, the losing side is far less ambiguous and far more painful. Start with ordinary Russians. To keep funding a war consuming more than 6% of the entire economy, the Kremlin has had to make choices that rippled directly into everyday life. Elvira Nabiullina, the head of Russia's central bank, has kept interest rates punishingly high throughout 2025 and into 2026, specifically to cool an economy overheating from war spending. High rates mean expensive mortgages, expensive business loans, and slower growth for anyone not directly tied to defense manufacturing. At the same time, Russia's finance ministry has pushed for cuts to non-essential government spending, the kinds of budget lines that fund infrastructure, regional services, and social programs unrelated to the war. Then there's Russia's sovereign wealth fund, the National Wealth Fund, which was built specifically as a financial cushion for moments like this. Before the war, its liquid assets equaled roughly 6.5% of Russia's entire economic output. By April 2026, according to the Kiel Institute, that cushion had shrunk to just 1.8%. In less than 4.5 years, Russia burned through the overwhelming majority of the rainy day fund it spent decades building, and there's no equivalent reserve waiting behind it once this one runs dry. On the Ukrainian side, the human and economic cost is more direct and in many ways more severe. Ukraine's economy has been operating under continuous bombardment for 4.5 years, power grids targeted, ports blocked, agricultural exports disrupted, and millions of working-age citizens either fighting, displaced, or supporting family members who are. Every dollar Ukraine spends on the war is a dollar not spent rebuilding schools, hospitals, or the energy infrastructure Russia has repeatedly targeted through the winter months. But the most interesting losers in this story aren't Russian or Ukrainian citizens directly. They're the governments and institutions caught in the middle, absorbing risks they never agreed to take on.
Belgium is the clearest example. Because nearly 200 billion euros in frozen Russian assets sit inside Euroclear, a financial institution headquartered in Brussels, Belgium. Belgium has become the reluctant custodian of the single most contested pile of money in this entire war. When European leaders proposed using those assets more aggressively to fund Ukraine, Belgium said no. Not because it opposed helping Ukraine, but because Russian officials made direct threats against Belgian interests if the funds were touched. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever has said publicly that Moscow warned its country would feel the consequences of any confiscation for eternity. Belgium didn't choose to be in this position. It became a financial hostage simply by hosting the institution where Russian money happened to be parked. European taxpayers more broadly are absorbing a slower but equally real cost. The 90 billion euro loan approved in December 2025 wasn't backed by frozen Russian assets. It was raised on capital markets, meaning it will eventually need to be repaid by European governments and ultimately European citizens, regardless of how the war ends or whether Russia ever pays reparations. And then there's the risk that rarely makes headlines at all: future generations on both sides of this conflict. Every ruble Russia borrows against its shrinking reserves, and every euro Europe borrows against capital markets, is a financial obligation that outlives the war itself. Wars end, debt doesn't. Someone, years from now, on both sides of this conflict, will still be paying down what's being spent on it today, long after the front lines have stopped moving.
Here's where the financial story of this war stops being about spreadsheets and starts being about the global balance of power. Because every dollar spent, saved, or borrowed in this conflict is quietly reshaping who answers to whom. Start with the most consequential shift of all: Russia's growing dependence on China. Before 2022, Russia was, by most measures, the senior partner in its relationship with Beijing, a nuclear superpower with its own independent foreign policy and no urgent need to defer to anyone. That dynamic has been quietly inverting ever since Europe cut off Russian energy imports. With nowhere else to sell oil and gas at scale, Russia has become structurally dependent on a single customer who can set the terms of the relationship. China doesn't need to invade anyone or fire a single shot to gain leverage over Moscow. It simply has to keep buying at whatever discount it chooses to demand. That's what economic dependency actually looks like in practice. It's not a treaty, it's not a headline, it's a pricing relationship where one side has options and the other doesn't. And the longer this war continues, the more Russia locks itself into a position where its most important strategic decisions, how much oil to sell, at what price, through which routes, are shaped less by Moscow's interests and more by what Beijing is willing to pay. On the other side of the ledger, Europe's handling of Ukraine's financing has become its own test of institutional power, specifically whether the European Union can act with real unity when the financial stakes are this high. The standoff over Belgium's frozen assets wasn't just a dispute about money. It was a test of whether 27 sovereign governments could agree to absorb collective financial risk in defense of a shared strategic interest. The answer, so far, has been a partial one. Europe found a way to keep funding Ukraine, but only by avoiding the harder, more consequential decision about the frozen assets themselves. That hesitation matters more than it might seem. Every time European leaders choose the smaller, safer financing option over the larger, more contested one, they're signaling something to Moscow: that Western unity, while real, still has limits, and that those limits can be tested, delayed, and negotiated around one summit at a time.
Meanwhile, the mechanism Ukraine depends on for survival, frozen Russian assets generating loan repayments through the ERA initiative, has quietly become one of the most significant financial innovations of modern geopolitics. It represents something the international system has never fully attempted before, using a sanctioned aggressor's own frozen wealth to fund the country it invaded, without technically confiscating that wealth outright. If this mechanism holds, it sets a precedent that could reshape how future conflicts are financed, a signal to any government considering aggression that its overseas assets could become collateral for its defense's victim. But precedents cut both ways. If the mechanism eventually fails, if political unity collapses, if Belgium's resistance hardens, if a future government decides the legal risk isn't worth it, that failure will be remembered too. It will tell every authoritarian government watching that international financial retaliation has real limits and that waiting out Western unity is ultimately a viable strategy. That's the real power struggle sitting underneath this war. It's not just about who controls territory in eastern Ukraine. It's about whether economic dependency can be weaponized as effectively as artillery, whether a country's balance sheet can become as decisive as its army, and whether the international financial system built over the last 80 years is actually strong enough to outlast a war it was never designed to fight.
If you've stayed with us this far, subscribe to Capital and Consequence and join us for more long-form documentaries about money, power, and the consequences behind the headlines. So, where does this financial war actually go from here? Nobody can say with certainty, but the available evidence points toward a handful of plausible paths, each shaped by decisions that are still being made in real time. The first scenario is the one Moscow is quietly betting on, that Western financial unity erodes before Russia's reserves do. Under this scenario, European governments facing their own domestic economic pressures gradually lose the political appetite to keep approving multi-billion euro aid packages year after year. Support doesn't collapse all at once, it just slows, package by package, summit by summit, until Ukraine's financing gap becomes difficult to close. Russia, meanwhile, keeps selling oil to China at a discount, keeps its war machine funded at a reduced but sustainable pace, and simply outlasts the West's patience rather than its resources. This is, by most accounts, the scenario Kremlin economic planners are explicitly designing for. The second scenario runs in the opposite direction. Russia's financial position deteriorates faster than its reserves can absorb. Under this path, the sovereign wealth fund continues shrinking towards zero. Sanctions enforcement tightens rather than loosens, and the combination of high interest rates, budget cuts, and shrinking reserves forces the Kremlin into increasingly difficult trade-offs between funding the war and maintaining basic domestic stability. Estimates suggest that if current spending trends continue without new revenue sources, Russia's most liquid reserves could be effectively exhausted within 1 to 2 years, though this figure carries real uncertainty since Moscow's actual financial position is only partially visible from outside. A third scenario sits between those two extremes, and it may be the most likely: a prolonged financial stalemate, where neither side's economy collapses, but neither side gains a decisive advantage either. Russia keeps selling oil to China at a discount, absorbing the pain but avoiding true collapse. Ukraine keeps receiving smaller, harder-won aid packages that keep it funded but never comfortable. Under this scenario, the war doesn't end because either side runs out of money. It ends, if it ends at all, through negotiation, because both sides eventually decide that continuing to bleed reserves indefinitely serves neither of them. What could change this calculus? A few specific variables matter more than others.
If China ever decided the reputational or economic cost of propping up Russia's war economy outweighed the discount it's currently extracting, Russia's financial position would deteriorate rapidly, though there's little evidence, so far, that Beijing sees any reason to change course. If European unity around the frozen Russian assets ever hardens into full confiscation rather than partial loan mechanisms, Ukraine's financial position would strengthen considerably, though Belgium's resistance suggests that outcome remains politically difficult, at least for now. And if global oil prices rise significantly due to conflict elsewhere, Russia's oil revenue could improve even under sanctions, giving Moscow more room to sustain current spending levels than today's numbers suggest. None of these are certainties. They're the variables that will determine, more than any single battlefield outcome, which government's balance sheet gives out first, and how much of the modern financial system built to prevent exactly this kind of war ends up getting rewritten in the process.
We started with a simple number, $21.5 million for every square mile of Ukrainian territory Russia has managed to take. That number was never really about land. It was a symptom of something much larger. A war that has quietly become less about who can advance the front line and more about who can survive their own balance sheet. Russia's answer has been to sell its energy to whoever will buy it, sanctions or not, and to let its national reserves absorb the difference between what the war costs and what oil revenue can cover. That strategy has worked in the narrowest sense. The war continues, the front line holds, the government keeps functioning. But it has come at the cost of a sovereign wealth fund built over decades, now reduced to a fraction of what it once was, and a deepening dependency on a single customer, China, who holds more leverage over Moscow's economy today than at any point in Putin's presidency. Ukraine's answer has been almost the opposite. Survive not through what the country produces, but through what the international system is willing to lend against a promise of future Russian reparations. That strategy has also worked so far. Ukraine remains funded, its government remains functional, its defense remains supplied. But it depends entirely on political unity that has to be renewed again and again by 27 governments, none of whom are obligated by anything more permanent than continued agreement. Neither side has found a sustainable answer. They've found a way to delay the moment when the money runs out, and delay, it turns out, is not the same thing as victory. What this war reveals, more than any battlefield map, is how much of modern conflict is decided somewhere far from the front line, in central bank vaults in Brussels, in tanker routes to Chinese ports, in interest rate decisions made in Moscow, in summit rooms where finance ministers argue over frozen assets that neither side is willing to fully release or fully return. The soldiers fight the war you see. The balance sheets fight the war that actually decides how long it lasts. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe to Capital and Consequence, drop a like, and share this with someone who follows global finance, geopolitics, or the war in Ukraine. Let us know in the comments, do you think Russia or Ukraine runs out of financial room first? And what story about money and power should we investigate next? For viewers who want the full research dossier behind this documentary, the Capital and Consequence dossier is available in the description. Until the next documentary. Capital and Consequence. Follow the money. Understand the consequences.